Hi everyone. Today we're going over the October-November 2016 data response questions. So the first part is compulsory. Everyone has to answer this, and I've selected question 5 from the optional paper so I can discuss it in a bit more detail. Okay, so let me just quickly check this is recording. Yep, we're all good to go. Okay, so the first question really concerns fiscal and monetary policy, and it's in the case of the recent recession that happened in 2007-2008, extending through to 2010 to 13. So question A asks, is a theoretical question, is asking for the difference between monetary and fiscal policy. So this is really something you can just knock off with definitions. So monetary policy is conducted by the central bank, and it involves, the lowering of interest rates as a way of boosting demand. With lower interest rates, it means firms can borrow more money cheaply, consumers can borrow more money cheaply. And this is one way in which aggregate demand via consumption can be boosted. The example given is towards the very end, where stimulating the economy by increased lending with low interest rates. If the central bank sets low interest rates, it means banks can borrow more money from the central bank, which they can then lend out in the form of loans at cheaper rates. Therefore, things like houses, cars, all these goods that really require some sort of initial borrowing schedule can then be facilitated. The purchase of which can be facilitated more easily with lower interest rates. That's the idea of a credit expansion as the banking sector booms with the lower interest rates. Now, fiscal policy is conducted by the government, and if we think of aggregate demand in terms of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, this is really affecting the government spending portion as well as the consumption portion. So fiscal policy can be conducted in two ways. It can either be conducted via an increase in the government spending. So the government itself is spending. This is the idea of the investment in public works, as it said, roads, bridges, public buildings. This all serves to boost aggregate demand, because to build these public works, construction companies, materials companies will have to be purchased from in order to buy the necessary resources to build these public works. So demand is stimulated there, and also to sort of set up these public works, there needs to be more workers need to be hired into the public sector, which creates jobs and therefore further stimulates the economy. The other way in which fiscal policy can be used is via taxation. Now, I don't think the article specifically mentions taxation, but it's good to also remember that the government can alter the level of direct taxation, which is income tax. And with lower income taxes, it means individuals have more of their income they can spend, so consumption increases, as well as indirect taxes, which is your VAT taxes on the price of goods in the shops. And lower prices, again, mean consumers can purchase more, increasing demand. So yeah, I've highlighted the two cases in the article in which monetary and fiscal policy have displayed in the small piece. And now moving on to question B, which is all about technological employment. And this it's also used obviously with structural employment. They mean similar things, but it's unemployment caused by a technological change, which means that demand for certain skills there's no longer a demand for certain skills. So an example of this, for example, would be in South Wales, where there used to be a booming coal industry, which was mainly labour intensive. There was a lot of workers involved, but increased technological improvements mean that a lot of workers are no longer required there, and this has been their quite specialist skills. There's no longer a demand for them with the advent of machines. Therefore, they fall into unemployment. We see mechanization all over the world, and that means all those people with quite intricate technical craft skills, their work is no longer needed because machines can actually produce goods that are probably a lot cheaper than can be produced by hand. And so this is the idea of technological unemployment. And among the less skilled and the elderly especially, once they fall into unemployment, it's very difficult for them to pick up new skills that are more relevant in the marketplace. So if you're 50 and 60 and you've just been unemployed, it's much more difficult for you to say go to school and pick up finance skills or soft skills or whatever, which there is demand for in the market. Similarly, again, the less skilled, once they're made unemployed. The unique skills they have, or the skills they don't have, because of that, their skills aren't really easily transferable in the labour market. If you're like a high finance MBA undergraduate, and you get unemployed from your big business or whatever, the skills that you have are very much in demand. So it's very easy for you to then get re-employed in a different business company or bank, for example. But if you're less skilled, or if your skill, more importantly, your skills are really unique to that specific industry, then it's very difficult for you to go refine unemployment once you've been unemployed to begin with. Therefore, the unemployment can often be made permanent. So part C is, again, more of an economics theory type of question. It's explaining what equilibrium less than full employment is. Now, it's difficult because I don't have a trackpad, so I'm going to have to try and explain, because it's a graphical question. I'll try and explain it verbally. So when the equilibrium is less than full employment, you can think of it, I don't know if you necessarily cover the difference between the classical and the Keynesian models. But it may be easier to initially think of it in terms of the Keynesian model, where we know the way the aggregate supply curve is shaped is at low levels of output, it's horizontal. But as output increases towards the full employment level, the aggregate supply curve becomes more and more vertical until at the full employment level, it's vertical. So we can see that an equilibrium can run at less than full employment if, say, there's a fall in aggregate demand and we move towards, say, the horizontal portion of the curve. At this point, the output is demand constrained, in the sense that although there are people who are willing to work, there are resources that can be employed. There's just not enough domestic demand that requires those resources to be used. Hence, we're no longer at the full employment level, which is directly referring to the resources, the labour, the land, the capital. And that's one way in which the economy can operate at a point below the full employment level, which is the vertical portion of the curve. At the vertical portion of the curve, all resources are being used. And therefore, if, say, there's an increase in demand, with no more resources to employ because they're all being used, the price of these resources, labour, land, capital, then increase. This is why it's vertical, because an increased demand then warrants an increase in price. But when the economy is less than full employment, this is not the case. There's unemployment, there's inefficient use of resources, and all of which means that we're operating on near the horizontal portion of the aggregate supply curve. If you were to sort of draw this graphically, think of it in terms of the initial equilibrium is on the vertical portion, the intersection between the aggregate supply and demand is on the vertical portion of the aggregate supply curve, but then there'd be a leftward shift in aggregate demand as demand decreases, and this would cause output to fall. It's an equilibrium in the sense that aggregate supply does equal aggregate demand, but it's not at this full employment level. Okay, so part D, which is contrast the opposing views in the articles about what the policy of the government should adopt. So I think, from my understanding of the article, the two real schools of thought is the extent to which this sort of government stimulus is a good way of creating jobs and boosting aggregate demand, which is a key way to get out of a recession. The recession is the point when the economy is at less than full employment, because there's just inefficient use of resources, which could be used if demand weren't constrained. So the one school of thought is that public expenditure is a way of boosting aggregate demand, because all these infrastructure projects, the roads, the bridges, they require those unemployed workers to be rehired, and they can be used to boost demand and increase output. And these also have supply side benefits, because roads, bridges, they're all infrastructure requirements for businesses, and therefore it could boost output via both demand and supply. That's the one school of thought. Also, it sort of in tandem with the US central bank trying to stimulate the economy. That's part of the opposing view, which is linked to the technological employment side, whereby although it may seem in theory quite popular to boost demand via government spending, to build these roads, bridges, public buildings, you need quite specialized construction skills. And the previously unemployed workers who've been unemployed by the recession may not necessarily have the skills possible to then immediately jump into this kind of work. If this asylum scheme were to work, it would require some sort of training program so these unemployment workers could get up to speed, which again is more difficult for the less. And but there's also the other school of thought with monetary policy, and the supporters of government policy in this case don't agree with boosting aggregate demand because of the context in which this recession is taking place, i.e. the credit crisis, where it was because of an asset bubble environment in which these banks could excessively lend and speculate, which then previously caused the crash. Low interest rates could further stimulate this sort of speculative behavior from banks. And in terms of looking at the evidence, rather than the government say directly boosting its spending via its own roads, bridges, public sector, what it does is it subsidizes private employers. So private employers now find it cheaper to say hire workers because they're getting certain amounts of money from the government to do so, and this allows them to hire more expansively. In this case, we can see 260,000 jobs have been created through this mechanism. And the other way in which is the other sort of school of thought that's mentioned is the raising of the minimum wage, and that's the idea of you can sort of in some ways boost demand because you're providing more workers, these workers at the very low end of the labour market with increased income that allows them to spend more. But with a higher minimum wage, there's the issue that if there's a higher wage, then there's a greater cost of production to firms, and therefore they're going to hire less because the cost of labour is now increased. So that's sort of the different components of government and monetary policy that have been mentioned in the article, and then you can sort of evaluate them as using the statistics. That's sort of the way to go about this question. Okay. Moving on to question 5. Now, this is again something that I'll try and explain verbally, but I think the top answers can really use graphs and plot this quite well. So it's the idea in perfect competition is there's no barriers to entry. All firms face the same sort of cost functions because technology is very much quite transparent in the market. So everyone has the same cost curves, and it's the sum of each of the individual firms' cost curves that make up the industry supply curve. There's a relationship between the individual firm and the industry. And the key with perfect competition is in the long run, there are zero profits made. And by zero profits, I don't necessarily mean they're making no money. It means they're making just enough money to keep them in that line of work, i.e. the profit minus the opportunity cost is equal to zero. They could earn 80,000, say, pounds doing the next best job. The zero profits would mean in this industry, they'll be earning, say, 80,000 pounds. However, in the short run, it's possible to have abnormal profits or positive profits in this case, or conversely losses. And although I can't necessarily draw the graphs, the way it works is if there's, say, an increase or decrease in demand for the industry, if you can think of the industry demand and supply curves, I think the way to look is that the industry demand and supply curves are your traditional downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply. But if you think of it in terms of the firm demand and supply curve, although their supply curve is their marginal cost curve, their demand curve is perfectly elastic in the sense that these firms are price takers. They have to supply at whatever price is in the market. It's not the case where there's an upward sloping supply curve in the case of a monopoly market. The supply curve is perfectly elastic. So if there's in the short run, there could be a change in demand such that price increases. This price increase can then lead to abnormal profits. But the key thing with a perfectly competitive market is because there's no barriers to entry, the potential for abnormal profits means that these firms, people who are spectating on this industry, who see that there are abnormal profits to be made, realize the profitability of entering this industry. So more and more firms then choose to enter this industry. This causes supply to increase. This is the relationship between the firm and the industry. The existence of abnormal profits means that more and more firms enter the industry. This causes the supply curve to shift outwards, thus lowering the price and bringing the economy back to equilibrium in the long run. So that's the relationship in the short run and the long run. In the short run, there can be positive profits that can be made, but it's this movement between in and out of the industry that causes the industry supply curve to shift and the price reaches its long run price such that normal zero profits are made. And if you want to think of it graphically, when the price equals the marginal cost, that's when the firm is making zero profits. And it's this upward shift in price that from demand changes that can cause price to be greater than marginal cost and positive profits to be made. But gradually, as industry supply increases and the curve shifts to the right, the price then falls back to the marginal cost. That's how the equilibrium works. Conversely, if there's, say, a fall in demand and firms actually start making negative profits, in this case, some firms leave the market, so industry supply falls. This causes the price to increase again. And therefore bringing it back into equilibrium where P equals MC. That's the key condition for a perfectly competitive market. I'll just check if this is still running. Yeah, we're all good. Okay, so now we're moving to the opposite sort of market structure, which is a monopoly. In this case, there is a barrier to entry. No other firms can really enter into this market, and you can think of like big energy or utility companies, or in this case, the government actually in a lot of industries. For example, like Royal Mail, they have a monopoly on that market. There's no way in which new firms can enter or firms can enter into this market. So there's no real shift. There's no real distinction between the firm and the industry. In a monopoly market, the firm is the industry. So price discrimination is basically, in simple terms, it's being able to charge different prices to different groups of consumers. And there's different types, which I suggest you maybe research as first degree, second degree, third degree price discrimination. First degree is the most extreme, in which the idea of price discrimination is that the firm wants to extract all of that consumer surplus. In your typical market, there are those consumers who would be willing to pay a high price, but end up only paying the market price, and they gain that surplus. What a monopoly firm would want to do is to charge that consumer who is willing to pay a higher price, and those consumers who are willing to pay a lower price, therefore extracting all of that consumer surplus. First degree is an extreme case where all consumer surplus is extracted, but I can only really think of auctions or potential bazaars or markets where there's some sort of price haggling mechanism can take place. That's the only way in which all the consumer surplus can be extracted. But I think the more common way we're looking at is third degree, where there are different sort of subsets of consumer, and they have different price elasticities of demand. That's the key. Those consumers with elastic, whose demand is price elastic, a small increase in price would lead to a larger reduction in the quantity they demand, and therefore they would warrant a lower price. Whereby those consumers who are price inelastic, whose demand is price inelastic, they can afford to be charged a higher price because the increase in price isn't going to reduce demand by that much. So the main conditions in which it's possible to set up price discrimination is that they've got to have separate markets. There should be no way in which, say, an inelastic consumer can purchase the good from the price of, say, the elastic consumer. There's got to be a way of separating the market. So if I think of this, for example, if we look at, say, like train tickets, and you can often see senior citizen discounts or student discounts. This is the idea that, say, senior citizens or students have a more elastic demand, especially, say, students who have a lower income, than, say, regular working consumers. And the way they can discriminate between the markets is like through using some sort of ID system or young person rails cards. This allows like rail companies to then distinguish between to stop the inelastic consumers from purchasing it at student rates, because there's some sort of barrier. And once you can separate these markets and you have the ability to charge different prices in these markets, then then price discrimination can therefore be set up. And it's mainly, as I said, initially beneficial towards the producers because it allows them to extract all of that consumer surplus and leads to positive profits in a monopoly case. It's also potentially beneficial to those price elastic consumers, such as the students, because they get a cheaper rate than, say, what would be possible in the case where price discrimination is not possible if there's no market separation. And these consumer groups therefore benefit from the lower prices and fares, the rebates that they can get. And I think finally, I think one other benefit is it sort of stops excess demand or congestion. If we think of, again, like say London trains, for example, you've got your peak and your off-peak time. If there was no distinction between those two, that's a form of price discrimination where it's discriminating between consumers who have to travel at one time compared with those who would be willing to travel at a later time where it's less busy. And because of that price discrimination, it means that trains aren't absolutely overcrowded. It means those consumers who really need to travel at a certain time will pay the higher price. And those who aren't are less willing to do so and instead care more about the price would buy the off-peak ticket, travel at 7, 8 p.m. And it therefore allows firms to sort of smooth demand, increase profit, but it's still, if say supply is constrained in the case of say train companies because they can only run a certain number of carriages, it avoids this excess demand and congestion situation. So those are, I say, some of the benefits from price discrimination. I hope you found that good, and if you've got any questions, because I can't really case to what you exactly have issues on, just let me know on Trello and I can do my best on those ones. Okay, thank you very much.